Welcome to this episode of Inside Legal ESG. We are so excited to have with us today Joel Makower. For 30 years, Joel has been a well-respected voice on business, sustainability, and innovation. An award-winning writer, speaker, and strategist on corporate sustainability practices and clean technology, he has helped both large and small companies align sustainability and clean technology with their business strategy and success. Welcome, Joel. It's truly an honor to have you with us today.
Great. Thanks so much, Pam. It's a pleasure to be here.
I think the introduction speaks for itself. You are such a legend in this industry. Clearly a visionary, because you started down this path many years ago. Tell us how you got started on this journey.
Yeah, I mean, it's been almost 35, I guess. I'm a journalist by training, and I've never can't figure out whether I'm a journalist cursed with an entrepreneurial streak or an entrepreneur cursed with a journalistic streak. But somehow I've been doing those two things and started several companies along the way. And I studied journalism in college because I didn't really have a clue what I wanted to be if I grew up. And my hypothesis at the time was that sticking my nose in other people's business and writing about it, through that process, I would find something that I was good at and interested in and synced with my values, lifestyle, or anything else. And for the first maybe 15 years or so, turns out what I was good at and interested in and synced with all that was just sticking my nose in other people's business and writing about it. And along the way, I discovered, environmental stuff had been part of my life since growing up. My parents were Sierra Club members back to the 50s. Mm-hmm. I will reveal my age here, a senior in high school during the first Earth Day. Sort of grew up in that world. But I had an opportunity in the late 80s to create a book called The Green Consumer. It came out actually in early 1990 during the run-up to what became a huge media event for Earth Day that year. And I was instantly anointed as an expert on green consumer issues. Very quickly had a weekly syndicated newspaper column in about 90 papers in the US, and was crisscrossing the country, actually traveling around the world, talking about the fact that every time you open your wallet, you cast a vote for or against the environment, and the marketplace isn't a democracy. It doesn't take 51% of people voting to make a difference. This was before I realized it didn't take 51% of people voting in a democracy, but that's a different story. And then I quickly realized two things. One, there was no green consumer movement in the US. I looked over my shoulder and realized I was kind of standing there by myself, and there may have been a reason that my book was called The Green Consumer. And it wasn't necessarily me, maybe it was you, Pam. But number two was that the companies I was being asked to come in and talk to about the so-called green consumer were themselves grappling with a whole bunch of issues around energy, water, waste, toxics, beginning of carbon and climate, and other issues. And that was interesting to me, and nobody was really writing about that. So 1991, I launched what we would now call a dead tree snail mail monthly newsletter called the Green Business Letter. And I ended up writing some other books on that topic over the 90s. And then I'm old enough to say the sentence. And then the web came along, and yes, I realized that I had always been an information pack rat, but all of a sudden I was now a content aggregator. And so I had this vision to create this sort of mother of all websites on business and the environment called greenbiz.com. And that became the company that's now 75 people strong, growing quickly, media and events, mostly events, and peer networks that we do. And so I'm at a point in life where nobody reports to me. We have a great executive team, and I'm more of a external champion, or not external, internal champion and mentor to the younger people coming into the field. And so, yeah, and it's been fascinating because this is a topic that never, ever gets old. And it's always morphing and changing and growing. And it's always the same storyline, which is there's this amazing amount of innovation, of progress, of goals and achievements by the world's largest companies and a lot of smaller, mid-sized ones, whether they're in manufacturing or the service sector. It's just astonishing to watch, and it's never enough.
Yeah.
It's just not going far enough, fast enough to meet the incredible social and environmental challenges we face.
Yes, I agree. You mentioned green biz, and that was my next question, was going to go down that path, because clearly the Green Biz Forum has become like the event every year that people gather at. I would love to get your perspective on how that event itself has changed, but also the content of that event. How has that changed over the years?
Sure. Well, I mean, it evolves. You know, we both follow and try to lead the community. First of all, we've learned along the way that the success of an event is certainly partly around great content, so that you got what you came for. It's certainly around creating a great experience, whether it's at a great venue or lots of meals and networking opportunities and extracurricular things like that. But it's mostly around creating community. And we work really hard at creating community. And that Green Biz event is every February in Scottsdale, Arizona. Not a bad place to be if you live anywhere north of the Mason-Dixon line, and even some other places in colder climates. It's certainly a compelling place to be, but we've really created a community because this is a field where most people in it they're sort of writing their own playbook. Mm-hmm. They don't really have that many mentors, and they're looking at just help. And there's at the same time a huge capacity among members of this community to share, much more so than in other fields. So just say, yeah, here's the contract language we use, here's the approach we use, here's how I sold it to management, here's how we're engaging employees. Here's whatever it is, come on over. I'll be happy to show you, give you a tour, send you the documents, because it's largely pre-competitive. And even when it's not pre-competitive, it's still, there's just still a huge appetite to share, because this is a field that the more people and companies that do these things and do these things well, the better it is for everybody. And no one's no longer at the tip of the spear. It's the spear itself. And so that's, I think, just really, and we've nurtured that. We really have nurtured that. And I think people come, we had this past February, 2023, we had 2,000 people. In 2022, the first post-COVID year, we had 1,400 people. And the first year, before that, we had slightly less. So it's just growing. And I think, and we had to cap it. We turned away several hundred people just because of space considerations. We're moving to a bigger venue, also in Scottsdale in 2024, 25, 26. So, and part of what, the topics, they continue to change and grow. We've leaned a lot more, for example, into innovation, but also into social issues, particularly as they relate to environmental issues, social equity issues. How do we bring more people of color into the field? We have spun out a nonprofit, greenbiz.org, to help grow the community of professionals of color in sustainability. And looking more at community, how environment issues relate to communities, sort of what they call the intersectionality of all these things, but also just, the issues like, so for example, biodiversity is evolving from a nice to do to a need to do issue, as we understand that the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and the social equity crises are all of a piece, and they're inextricably linked. And particularly with biodiversity and climate, you can't solve one without solving both.
Right.
You really need to solve both. And so that's a topic that's coming on strong. A few years ago, it was the circular economy. Certainly along the way, it's been, ESG and reporting and disclosures and new mandates and things like that. But there's also the perennials. How do you engage employees? How do you sell to management? How do you engage suppliers? There's the so-called scope 3 emissions around supply chains. Renewable energy, build, buy, now, wait. I mean, there's just so many things and there's so many new companies and new people in those companies coming into the field that there's just this hunger to learn more. And how do you, and then there's just the life cycle of a sustainability professional coming in, often as a 20 something, and how do you progress in your career? Where do you land within the company to be most effective? And what happens when you time out, either voluntarily or involuntarily, but still have a lot to give? And there's a lot of those people now as well.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned regulations and scope 3 and disclosures and reporting requirements and so forth. Do you have a prediction for us on what you think the SEC is ultimately going to put forth hopefully later this year?
Well, no. And there's a wide gap between what the SEC is going to put forth and what the politics of the day is going to allow.
Right.
So I have, as I'm often in this field, I'm very hopeful and also very pragmatic. I'm a pragmatic optimist in this world in general, certainly in this field of here's the thing, Pam, is that a lot of companies saying, all right, SEC, great, we'll need that. That's always the baseline. We're going to be doing this stuff anyway, not because it's the right thing to do, although that may be part of it, but it's because this is what our customers, our investors are demanding. And also, by the way, if you're a company that's bigger than a bread box, you're probably doing a lot of business outside the US. In fact, most of the US companies you can name, more than 50% of their revenue comes from outside the United States of America. And so they have to be hewing to European standards and Asian standards, and in some cases, South American standards, Latin American standards. And so they're going to be going by the highest standards globally. If that's what the EU mandates say, they're probably going to be, they may be doing some tweaks, but they're not going to be lowering their standards in the US. And so, regulations are generally for the cheaters and laggards. The definition of a regulation is that if it was any worse, it would be illegal. And so that's not the highest aspiration of most companies. And most companies, and by the way, it's not just what their investors and customers want, it's also the ability to attract and retain talent, which in any job market, and certainly this one, is a significant thing. And so there's lots of reasons beyond the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission to be disclosing climate risk, understanding climate risk. I mean, your insurers, your property casualty insurers want to know which of your facilities is in harm's way. What are you doing about that? What are your contingency plans for the next pandemic, supply chain disruption, ship that gets stuck in the Suez Canal, or whatever the calamity is? And so this is going to go whatever the SEC and the Republican Congress ends up letting out, enacting.
So since you brought up politics, let me go there next, because this morning in your newsletter, Green Buzz, you addressed how ESG, the concept or the term, is becoming a political football for those who are anti-woke or anti-ESG, I guess, for lack of a better word. Give me your take on that and where you think that's going to end, if in fact it's going to end.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty small cohort that's fanning the flames of ESG and woke stuff. It's a bunch of state attorneys general and some governors, and most people can name at least one of them, and there's and some other legislatures, and they've been pretty good and abetted by the echo chamber of cable news and blogs and podcasts and social media, of stoking this outrage about ESG and woke. And there's some argument, and ESG as a, beyond the three letters, it's a whole set of criteria, and there's a bunch of different criteria and a set of ratings and rankings and other things. And the system is not, it needs fixing. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. Just for example, most people assume that ESG ratings reflect how good a company is for the planet. Not at all. ESG ratings relate to risk, not to impact. Most people don't understand that, and that's just one thing that needs to be straightened out. But this sort of manufactured outrage, as I think of it, is it's going to be around for a while. Certainly going to be part of the next election cycle, and maybe the one after that. But I think it's going to die down into 2 or 3 years. And it's the piece I wrote that you're referring to, Pam, is one where I want to talk to companies and saying, how is this changing anything for you? The fact that companies that politicians, a small number of politicians and others are now, stomping their hands and feet around these issues. And the reaction is, well, we're not stopping anything because, first of all, our customers demand it, and our employees demand it, and our investors demand it, as I was saying before. We're just not going to talk about it as much. Mm-hmm. And that's a disservice. That's unfortunate, because companies already don't talk about what they do. Contrary to what most people think, Pam, this is an area where companies are walking more than they're talking. They're doing more than they're saying. And we can talk about it if you want why that is, but the reality is that it's problematic to talk about, just because most, marketing tends to talk in communications in general tends to talk in absolutes. We're the biggest, the best, the greenest, the, whatever it is. Sustainability is incremental inherently. Yeah. One foot in front of the other, little change at a time, day by day, month by month, year by year. And so that's hard to reconcile. And so most companies just, to say we're a little less bad than we were last year, but not as good as we'll be next year, is like, okay, good on you, but why are you even talking about that? And so companies are just going to go underground. This thing will run its course at some point. It'll probably be persistent in the background, but not as visible for some years to come. But as I said, it's not really stopping anything, because again, just like with the SEC rules, this is something that's happening of its own accord. It would be great if there was political support, political cover. I think more companies would do more things. It would be great if there was a unified set of rules and standards and frameworks that companies could know what the playing field looks like and how level it is, and things would go further faster. But even in spite of that, I mean, look, during the 4 years of the previous president, when environmental progress, at least at the regulatory and public policy level, stopped or reversed, mostly reversed, mm-hmm. Companies did not slow down 1 mile per hour in their efforts. They continued. In fact, you could make a case that a lot of this accelerated during those 4 years, possibly because of the lack of political support, and said, well, we're going to do this anyway. In fact, now we're going to double down. Yep. So, that's a glass half full view of all this stuff. I could certainly give you the glass half empty part, but I'm going to stick with that.
Yeah. And I also think, in addition to your, the incremental steps, and companies don't necessarily like to talk about incremental progress, I also think that at least for private companies, they're not used to that much transparency, especially not about incremental progress.
Well, and that's certainly true for law firms, consultancies, yes. And a lot of your audience. I'm going to talk about law firms for a minute. I know I'm not an expert, but I was reflecting on it, and I've sort of watched, I don't know, I'm going to say 3 phases of this. The first one goes probably back 10, 20, maybe even 25 years, which is sort of a, greening up operations. So the, law firm impacts was about paper use, for example, mm-hmm. and maybe employee commuting and keeping the lights, putting in energy efficient lighting and basically those kinds of things. In the early 2000s, I had the chance to sit down with one of the partners with one of the largest law firms in California, and probably one of the top 20 in the US, and to talk more about what was then called clean technology. And I said, so what's the big opportunity your firm sees in clean technology? And I was thinking they're going to talk about contracts. They're going to talk about startups and capital formation and some other things. And she said, litigation. And I was like, wow, I didn't see that coming. And she explained to me that litigation is often when there's novel things going on in the economy. There's a wind farm, and is that a utility, or are they a farm? Are they a real estate? What are they? That there's different kinds of contracts and different kinds of things. So that maybe 2.0 is figuring out what's the opportunity there. But now it's how do law firms compete in a world that's looking for not just responsibility and ESG focused activities within their own operations and with their own supply chains. That includes their service providers. And so banks, insurers, law firms, PR firms, and others are now under the microscope or the Klieg lights or whatever metaphor you want, and are suddenly having to have policies and have practices and have goals and targets and timetables just to get client business.
Yep.
And that's I think I think it's not early days, but I think it's just the beginning of a relative beginning of that. I think it's going to be more and more. And you've probably experienced this with some of your work, that that law firms saying we don't this is the same thing that companies went through, and it's still going through, but it's not that many years ago, where it's like, what do we need to do to be seen as a player, to be good enough? It's sort of an odd question. How good do we have to be?
Right.
But that's in effect the question that a lot of firms are now having to ask.
Yeah. And do we really have to go through the process of measuring our greenhouse gas emissions? And how do we do that?
And how do we do that? And how far out? Where do we draw the boundaries? Do we talk about the truck that delivered the gas that went into the gas pump that our employees use to commute to work, or or the how do we draw this? And the good news is that if you're a law firm, you're not the first to go through this, and someone else has already done this. And I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know for a fact that the American Bar Association or other state bars have task force and working groups and best practices and workbooks and other things on these topics. But it's still a thing that never been done before. You probably don't have staff to do that. It's got to be somebody's part-time job on the side. So there's going to have to be some partner who's in charge of overseeing that, because this does get into liability issues potentially, and when you start disclosing these kinds of things, and it does quickly roll up to legal issues, even inside a law firm.
Yep. And for their clients, right? It's often the general counsel at a company that has to give final approval on any disclosure. So yeah, it's definitely a legal issue in many respects. You used the phrase earlier that you're a pragmatic optimist. So what do you see that gives you hope?
Well, the people flocking to this field gives me hope. The young people in particular gives me hope. There's this huge influx of Gen X, Gen Z and millennials coming into the field, and they get it. They truly get it, and they understand that this is about their future as well. So that gives me hope. But I think I am so enamored of the sustainability professionals inside, particularly big companies, who are armies sometimes of 1 or 3 or 7 people inside a multi-billion-dollar global company with huge mandates and no resources, and how they often swim upstream and or even misunderstood or seen, like, oh my God, here comes Pam, look busy.
Yes, exactly. Here comes Pam with her pet project, right?
Yeah,
Someone
exactly.
said that to me once.
And yet they succeed mightily. Sometimes, over time at considerable personal cost, at making change, and that gives me great hope of the passion, the persistence, the persuasion, the resourcefulness of people in this field. And then lastly, there's a whole technology piece of this that's coming on strong, that's enabling. Some of it's not green technology, some of it's just things like blockchain, that are enabling tracking and tracing and things that are critically needed in this field. And there's a whole slew of those. We do a whole conference called Verge on climate tech that we'll get 5 or 6 or 7,000 people coming to this event at the San Jose Convention Center in October. And this is a hugely hopeful space right now.
So I'm going to switch tracks a little bit here, because as I was doing research for this podcast, of course, I knew about your sustainability life. What I did not know is that you are the author of like the definitive book about Woodstock. So tell me how that came to be.
Well, this actually predated, but not by much, sort of my entry into the sustainability world. This was in the mid 80s. And I was coming up on there's starting to be a number of 20th anniversaries of things that were key in my life. And I remember one of them that I remember specifically, this is probably, I guess, would have been like 1987, was the 20th anniversary of Sgt. Pepper's, the Beatles album. And it's like, wow, that's been 20 years. Like, wow, that whole era is now 20 years old. 1968, which was this incredibly volatile year with, the Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King assassinations and the Democratic Convention in Chicago, and stuff that I lived through. And then in 1969, one of those was Woodstock. And as I looked into the story of Woodstock, I thought it was a really fascinating story about these young entrepreneurs coming together to create this festival that was really meant to, the profits of which were going to finance a recording studio in Woodstock, New York. And that never happened. And then they started to build this, sort of really cobbling it together. And then 5 weeks before the event, they got thrown off their land that they had contracted with this town of Wallkill, New York, to have this festival. And then it had to relocate it. And they finally found Max Yasgur and his alfalfa farm, dairy farm, alfalfa fields, in White Lake, New York, where they had the event, and the rest is history. I just found that was a fascinating story that had never been well told. At the same time, I had just read a couple of oral histories, and I really decided that was a fascinating format. So I did an oral history, talked to the 4 producers, the 4 main producers, and about 30 of their people who designed the stage and built the plumbing and the porta-johns and booked the acts. And then the people in the town, Mrs. Yasgur, because Max, her husband, had passed, Abby Hoffman, Wavy Gravy of the hog farm that provided this novel security, and just put it all together into a book and audio form. And it's just a great story. It's still out there. The book was reissued in 2009 for the 40th anniversary. And a lot of it was adapted into a PBS documentary called Woodstock 3 Days That Defined a Generation. It came out in 2019 for the 50th anniversary. So I guess, and the original recordings, all the interviews, 70 or 80 interviews, face-to-face interviews I did, are all now housed in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Library and Archive in Cleveland. And so it's just been a fascinating project that I did not think I would still be engaged with, more than 30 years later. But it's, and it really does. And the last thing I'll say, Pam, is, and it sort of segues into the green stuff that really happened right about that time in 1989 for me, was it really talked about the ingenuity, resourcefulness, vision, humanity that the so-called Woodstock generation, later called the Woodstock generation, brought, and how it dealt with these, what should have been a catastrophe in a lot of ways, with the weather and the drugs and the police and the yippie radical left and all sorts of things, that this could have gone hugely sideways. And the fact that it didn't really reflected a lot of not just who we were in 1969, but also of what was possible. And I think it really helped set the stage, for me at least, to be looking at this sort of world of green and socially and environmentally, and now sustainable and regenerative and just businesses.
Yep. And that it is possible. We just have to focus on it.
Exactly.
So my final question, if I were to convince you to come back a year from now, what will have changed? What will we talk about a year from now?
Well, it's not going to be a radically different conversation, Pam. It's going to be, more of same, but the emphasis is on more. And that there'll be more companies doing more things. There will be some breakthroughs. I mean, some of these things have been long in the making, and all of a sudden, actually, in some ways, the pandemic and the war in Ukraine have catalyzed a lot of change, that we recognize our reliance on fossil fuels, and we need to, and particularly out of foreign countries, hostile nations, we need to start being more independent on that front. We need to move off of fossil fuels. The gas prices help spur markets for electric vehicles. The supply chain shortages and disruptions help bring reshoring manufacturing and creating more resilience in supply chains and therefore in communities. So a lot of this stuff continues to happen, and I think we'll be talking about, so what's next? Where's this? Where's all this going? What are the sort of pleasant surprises or things that, it's that old Hemingway line about how did you go bankrupt? Slowly, then suddenly, or gradually, then suddenly, I think is the line. And, a lot of these things, electric vehicles, gradually, then suddenly, solar and wind, gradually, then suddenly. And, there's things like the circular supply chains and the circular economy in general, still in the gradually part, but I think we'll start to see some things happen there. So I don't know what they will be. I just know that they will be those things, and I look forward to speaking with you about them.
Well, I certainly will be inviting you back, because this conversation has been delightful. Thank you for sharing your insights with us. I know the listeners will really find it valuable, and we'll talk again in a year. Thank you, Joe.
I look forward to that. Thank you, Pam.